Well, let's get to our next clip. This is our buddy Morley Robbins. Let's
I've been waiting for this one all my life.
And guess where all of the steroid hormones are being made? They're being made in our adrenal glands. Right? And so where's all the attention in medicine? Our thyroid. Thyroid makes one hormone. The adrenal glands make 50 hormones. And so it makes perfect sense to obsess about the thyroid and lead people to think that the thyroid runs the body. It does not. That's an absolute lie. And have people ignore the adrenals. Well, there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. It's mitochondrial dysfunction of the cells that make up the adrenal gland. And I just learned that this morning.
I am empathetic to him saying that medicine is wrong about most things. So I think he's definitely right there. But
yeah, but when does medicine say that?
They never say it's all the thyroid.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a straw man. Well, just
he wasn't talking medicine. He was talking about, I think, the bioenergetic.
Yeah.
The bioenergetic view. Yeah. He just said medicine.
Yeah, it was.
The thing is, it's so like the whole perspective. It's like it blows my mind. So first we say it's not the thyroid, and then we say it's the adrenals, and then we say that it's a problem with the mitochondria in the adrenals. And then, but like you first discounted the thyroid, which is a key for mitochondrial function. So just the whole thing is like this weird, confused circle that doesn't really make any sense. Again, this is not a personal attack, but like I'm listening to this and I'm just like, what is going on here?
This morning, Mike, chill out. Okay. What?
Mike's a little excited.
Okay,
understandably so.
What? I feel like this is essential to understanding kind of the bioenergetic stuff, but the relationship between the thyroid, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenals. How do you guys see that, and where do you think Morley is making a mistake?
Well, so the first thing I mean, there's a couple things. One, I want to just state his argument point by point. So he's saying, like, forget what he says. Like, okay, so I guess first point, modern medicine focuses everything's on the thyroid. Next point is the adrenal glands produce 50 hormones. The thyroid produces 1, and it's a lie that the thyroid runs the body. And instead, he's kind of making the assumption that it's the adrenals that do, but within the adrenals, there's nothing to do with adrenal fatigue. It's mitochondrial dysfunction. So that's like our points that we have here. And one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that the thyroid is not we have talked about this, Mike and I just put out a thyroid series, and we discuss how the thyroid is not a root cause either, right? The thyroid function and activity is a product of the general energetic state of the body, what is going on in the mitochondria throughout the body, not just the adrenals, and a number of other factors, nutritional status, all these other things. So it is true that I wouldn't consider it as the thyroid runs everything and that we need to focus solely on the thyroid, but rather the thyroid is a good representation of what's going on underneath. But you could also look at what's going on with adrenal steroid production too. If you're seeing a lot of cortisol, that's also a helpful indication as well. So I think there is a point of validity there, which is that we shouldn't be only focusing on the thyroid. I think the other point is we shouldn't be focusing on any organ function because we want to consider what's actually going on those underlying levels, and the signals and everything on top of that will be shown through hormone production. And looking at the thyroid activity is really helpful. And I will say, when looking at all of the hormones and when looking at, top down what's going on above the energetic level, the thyroid is affecting everything else. Like it is in some ways you can consider it as a master regulator that's going to affect the production of other hormones. It's going to affect mitochondrial function. It's going to affect gut function and on and on. So it is important to consider in that way. So I guess that's my first thoughts. Danny, what was your question exactly?
When he brought this up, and I think I originally clipped it because he's making a claim of how the thyroid, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenals interact. And I think that's really critical to understand. Like you said, if you have high levels of cortisol, through understanding when the thyroid is suppressed, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals start to rev up like that. That's really important to understand. But nobody's saying, micro focus on the thyroid gland itself. There's a macro thing that's happening like the mitochondria as stress response modulators, and the inflammatory cytokines that the cells are producing, activating the stress systems, etc. But I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
I think that it's all one system, right? Like basically all the hormonal things that we're looking at are messages between the cells saying, hey, this is what we have going on. And so when you're looking, like when I'm looking at the whole, when I look at this, I see a whole system. I see the adrenals, I see the thyroid, I see what's going on with the gonads. You're like looking at all these different things to kind of read the messages that the body is saying, what the cells are saying to each other, and get a sense of what is the overall context of the system. So like if you're seeing somebody who has thyroid dysfunction and then they're having elevated cortisol and then DHEA is low, and then you're looking at, I don't know, maybe prolactin is elevated as well, and then like gonadal function is not going so hot. It's like they're under stress. And then the question is like, where is that stress coming from? Is it dietary? Is it lifestyle related stress? Is it related to, is it something going on there where they exposed to some type of toxic exposure? Do they have some type of chronic infection? Did they just come out of like an extremely difficult work period? Like looking for what are all of these other areas that we have control over to see what's affecting the system overall, and trying to correct those foundational pieces all together, and then maybe use some support along the way as well to like kick the system into gear. So that's for me, that's when I'm looking at it, that's what I'm seeing. I'm not like saying, oh, it's just all the thyroid. It's just what blows my mind about this is that if you're going to you're going to make a question about any steroid hormone, right? So you're going to make some argument about any type of steroid hormone and then first discount the thyroid, like thyroid hormone and thyroid function. That doesn't make any sense, because the thyroid is what's pushing cholesterol into the cell, and then it's what's pushing cholesterol into the mitochondria. And then that cholesterol in the mitochondria is being converted into steroid hormones. So if thyroid function is not going well, then all of the other steroid functions are not going well. It's likely they are not going well. To discount the thyroid and then focus on the adrenal, because there's this number of hormones there and that number of hormones there, which is kind of irrelevant to the overall picture. It's like completely besides the point. It doesn't even, the thyroid is what's determining the production of some of these things to a large extent. So yeah, that for me, when I'm looking at that, I'm like, it's missing the mark. It's not seeing the underall picture, and it's not understanding what thyroid hormone's actually doing. And then to further bring a question about like, oh, it's the mitochondrial function of the adrenal gland. It's like the thyroid is what's inducing respiration in the mitochondria, inducing production of new mitochondria, all of these types of things. It's regulating mitochondrial function directly. So to discount thyroid and then make an argument about mitochondria again is just completely missing the mark, and indicating that, yes, he likely just learned it that morning because he's not seeing all the different pieces and or understanding what they're actually doing, and also putting it within a bioenergetic context, understanding like the value of energy, and seeing like the adrenal hormones are there as a system to help manage energy deficits and stress pathways. Thyroid hormone is there to make sure that you have it's a signal that you have adequate amount of energy overall and to increase energetic production. So like these systems are like it's not that they're opposed to each other, but the context with which they get upregulated are opposed to each other. And it's actually important to look at both.
Yeah, that's so important. What you said, the dual cofactor nature of thyroid, the hormone of respiration, and then the hormone of steroidogenesis. And that's, I think, really integral to understand. Jay, what else do you think?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I want to mention. One, as you said, Mike, it sounds like we're operating on quite a loose definition of learning here, which I think also is important when it comes to the next video as well. And normally, I don't think it's worth talking about an argument like this, or talking about somebody making these sorts of statements, but we get sent these things all the time, and people really eat these ideas up. And so just as something that I think I need to say, if somebody is trying to make an argument that something is more important because of some sort of numerical factor, that it is involved in more processes or more enzymes or more hormones, I would consider that with quite a bit of skepticism, because it means nothing in terms of what's actually going on physiologically. In this case, the thyroid does not produce one hormone. It produces at least two, if you want to consider T3 and T4. You could also consider T1 and T2 and others. But so So, and the point that the adrenal makes 50 hormones has nothing to do with whether one is more important than the other. Like it is, if someone is trying to also make the argument that some mineral runs the body or is more important than another mineral because it's involved in more enzymes or something like that, those things are just entirely irrelevant when in terms of trying to compare importance of different nutrients and things like that, and has very little to do with what's going on the ground level in terms of physiology, in terms of health. So that's the only argument he's relying on here in terms of why the adrenals matter more than the thyroid, which is kind of his point. As the other thing I wanted to mention, as you were saying, Mike, is so he was saying that adrenal fatigue, it doesn't exist, and instead is mitochondrial dysfunction in the adrenals. And even if we just want to isolate things like cortisol and adrenaline when we're talking about adrenal hormones, those are not, their production isn't just regulated by what's going on in the adrenal glands. It's regulated by what's going on systemically. If your blood sugar is low, if your muscles are running out of fuel or aren't producing energy well, or your liver, wherever else, or considering all the other hormones, that are like ACTH and things like that are going to affect adrenal output. Like those things are all, again, I don't think we like the characterization or idea of adrenal fatigue either, but to then isolate it to mitochondrial dysfunction in the adrenal glands themselves is, again, entirely missing the point of what's actually going on in the human system inside the body. I mean, this is the way that a lot of these sorts of arguments are made, is it's a myopic reductionist look at what's happening in this organ, and this organ's more important than that organ, and look at how this mineral is involved in all these processes. And again, we're totally losing sight of the big picture and how these things are actually relevant. And yeah, this sort of argument, I think, is the perfect example of that.
Yeah,
even the research. Go ahead, Danny. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just to go a little bit further, like when a person has lower thyroid function and they're under the duress of constant stress, the layers of the adrenal glands will erode over time, right? So like the outer layer produces like DHEA and progesterone, I think, and then maybe the inner more layers can produce aldosterone and cortisol. And so I think the capsule is like eroding over time under intense stress, but that's not the same as adrenal fatigue, because when I was talking to a naturopath a long time ago, he read a book called William Jeffries' Safe Uses of Cortisol, and it was like his Bible. And when he found that I had high cortisol, he tried to prescribe me Cortef, or he did prescribe me Cortef. And the whole idea was to let my adrenals rest. But the sad thing was I was freezing cold at the time, and I think my pulse was like 40 or 50 or something. So it's just, so I definitely familiar with the idea of adrenal fatigue, but I mean, even Morley is saying that it's wrong, but go ahead.
Well, the thing too is that you're saying, Danny, that I want to highlight specifically is that the layers that produce DHEA do erode, but the layers that produce cortisol don't actually really erode that much into old age. So what you wind up getting is unopposed cortisol as you age, unopposed glucocorticoids, unopposed mineralocorticoids, so aldosterone and cortisol. Now, the thing about DHEA is DHEA directly opposes many of the negative effects of cortisol. So when you're under stress and your body is releasing cortisol, it's also releasing DHEA. So it's basically you have both these hormones. The cortisol goes and kind of mobilizes resources, lowers inflammation through your immune suppression mechanism. And then DHEA kind of like prevents it from getting too far, right? Creating too much damage. It's like this nice backstop. It's a protective mechanism. But as you get older, you don't have that anymore. So you just release cortisol, you start shredding your tissues up, you start like moving towards immunosuppression. And that's why some of the authors that Peat cites talks about like the aging process being characterized by like the glucocorticoids and the adrenal hormones overall. So like optimizing for those is not ideal, especially coming from the bioenergetic context when you're looking at them as like they are literally the hormones of stress. They are there for all the scenarios that you mentioned, Jay, to basically if the body doesn't have enough energy at that moment, or it has an extreme demand, whatever that is, to like meet that challenge. And the problem is long-term upregulation of that damages other tissues, because it's basically like it will shift resources to the important tissues. It'll remove resources from the less important tissues like the gonads and like the digestive tract. And then it's like it releasing resources from stores of the body. So you are breaking down the body. This is directly opposed to Ray's hypothesis of energy and structure interdependent at every level, or it's the antithesis of it, right? So it's essentially, let's break down our structure so that we can provide this energy. And it's like, now you don't have more structure to produce or garner energy because you're constantly breaking it down with these hormones. So that, yeah, it's like, I don't think focusing on the adrenals or like the adrenal fatigue piece is key. I think if anything, when you're looking at the adrenal fatigue stuff, you're seeing like somebody who has been chronically stressed out. And it's almost like in Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome, they are at that fatigue point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have adrenal fatigue. It's like entire body fatigue from running on these adaptive pathways and corrupting the metabolism along the way. And Jay, you and I recently did the released episode talking about the effects of the stress hormones in the mitochondria, where acute exposure to stress will raise adrenaline, raise cortisol, and then those actually can stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis and upregulate fatty acid oxidation inside the mitochondria of the cells. But if that goes on at too high a level or for too long, then what happens is the mitochondria just degrade. Like they literally break down. They become, and then they have to undergo mitophagy, so they break apart, and then you basically have no energy production. And I think that's what you're seeing with the fatigue piece, and the mitochondria being actually like a really key element of this, which goes back to the central point of energy being central to everything that you have going on in the cell.
And that's such a contrast too from, again, zooming out, like the idea of energy being a driver of health in comparison to a model of health where you're trying to determine what gland or hormone or mineral or vitamin is more important than the other or than another. What an odd way to consider health. Like what question are we answering here? Which gland is more important? Like what is that? Like, like which mineral is more important, magnesium or zinc? Like what are we talking about here? Like this is such an odd conversation to be having or question to be asking. Like, what is this view of health that we're talking about?
Well, that's why we just need to talk about insulin and blood glucose. Those are actually the most important things.
Right.
Yeah.
Evil glucagon.
Yeah.
Yes. I think the goal is like, what you guys are getting at is to kind of like incorporate everything together and understand that like all of the nutrients are needed to in some amounts and for the system to function. And there are some things that are problematic, like what we were talking about with endotoxin being directly antithetical to energetic function through driving lipolysis, like you mentioned, Danny. So it's like, it's not like it's just the microbiome, or it's just the adrenal glands, or it's just the thyroid, or it's just that it's like iron is the devil and you need all this copper, or vitamin D is it's rat poison or something like that. It's like, you want to see all of these things. So like when you're looking at vitamin D, you're looking like, where's your vitamin D? Where's your calcium? Where's your parathyroid hormone? What is your status for your calcium status for bone, for all this type of stuff? What is your status in terms of stress and versus energetic production? So what's going on with the adrenal glands? What's going on with thyroid? What's going on with gonads? And then you're looking at what's going on with gut function. If there are problems there, is that creating endotoxin? And you're basically trying to figure out like, where are the chinks in the system? And how can we correct this overarching piece so that the system has enough resources and it doesn't have the blocks on it so that things can run appropriately? Because if the idea here is that if given the right resources in the right context, the body will and the metabolism will run appropriately. It's not trying to not run well. Like it's not like there's just this genetic problem with all of us and we're not functioning well. It's like, I think Danny, you're the one who actually said this on one of the generative energies, is like Hans Selye was talking about, like he's surprised that people even live, like that organisms are even able to live with all of the stressors that they're exposed to. And so it's like taking away those things allows the system to function appropriately and to build resilience and things along those lines. And you need them, the magnesium cure or whatever the deal is. Like, no, you need magnesium. You also need calcium. You also need vitamin D. You also need vitamin K. And too much of some of these things, like overdosing them, is likely to be a problem. So like, that's the thing, is like putting it comprehensively and understanding all the pieces of the system and seeing where the chinks are.
Yeah, well said. That was Albert St. Georgi said that. He was surprised that people were even alive at all. But one other thing, and I know we're probably beating a dead horse at this point, but everything that Morley talks about, from copper to the adrenals to magnesium. Those things are basically impossible to understand without thyroid. Like thyroid enhances the absorption of copper. Like thyroid enhances the retention of magnesium. Thyroid downregulates the need to use your adrenals. And so it's really running. Everything I've seen of Morley's, it's really running without a foundation. But that's most of the health world, so we couldn't be too down on Morley.